kind of organized this evening. We had something happen at church one Sunday, and it involved us having to help somebody. And then after spurred on a whole bunch of questions, which were very valid questions of how we can be Christ-like and serve, but also serve safely and effectively, how not to put ourselves in danger, but yet still love the people that are here and learn how to maybe see things that are happening that we may not even know are happening. So we brainstormed a little bit and came up with a panel of people who we thought would be great to kind of just give a brief overview of different areas of things that we can think about, things that we will run into, each come with a different background and different information to give us. So I'm going to just introduce them, and then they're going to sit up here. Each of them will speak, and then there will be a time of question and answer. So my printer only printed part of the words, so I'll do my best here. Brian is a housing worker at Indwell. Indwell is a Christian charity that creates affordable housing communities and supports people seeking health, wellness, and belonging. Brian works at the Perkins Center, which is Main and Kenilworth, and he's a part of a team that manages 4 buildings with approximately 200 tenants. This is where my printer stopped working. Brian actively supports these tenants as they face day-to-day challenges. He organizes social and creative activities in the building and runs a weekly music group. Brian and his wife attend St. Clair Community Church, and they lead a home group called A Missional Family. John Kautecki is the Executive Director of Family Outreach Ontario, Christian Addiction Support Services. He has served in this capacity since 2011. He is also very active in a Christ-centered 12-step program called Celebrate Recovery. More importantly, he experienced victory in his own struggle with alcoholism. He fully understands what it's like to be shattered by addiction, as well as what it is like to recover. He gives all glory to his higher power, Jesus Christ, and proudly proclaims but for the grace of God, I go. John is happily married and lives with his wife of 40 years, Darcy, in Guelph. Kevin Hike, most of you probably know Kevin. He's a police officer here in Hamilton, but he is also a member of Blessings, and as we are all part of Blessings. He lives here in Hamilton with his wife and children. He's been a police officer in Hamilton for 13 years, and he worked as a patrol officer on the mountain, and now he's here in this end of the city. He worked for a year on action team and several years as a detective in provincial auto theft team, criminal investigations branch, and the homicide unit. So they can come up here, and I don't think there's an order, so whoever wants to start can start, and I'm going to turn the floor over to them. Pastor Ian's number is on the screen, because if you don't feel comfortable to ask a question, you can text it to Pastor Ian, and he'll pass it on at question and answer time. Do you want to start, Brian?
Great, sure, I can start. Well, thanks for having us this evening. My name is Brian Dexter, and I work at Indwell. Been there for a couple of years. So my role, I'm an apartment support worker. My role, my day-to-day job is daily supporting our tenants, and I'm usually at the Perkins Center, which is at Main and Kenilworth here in East Hamilton. In that particular building, we have 46 bachelor apartments. It used to be a series of different bars, and I think it was Rookie Sports Bar for a while, the Driftwood Tavern, if you're Hamiltonian, you might remember some of those landmarks. So we took ownership of that building, I think it was almost 8 years ago now. reconfigured the space and added a third story to that existing structure. And there were just a lot of really thoughtful changes and improvements to the building to allow for natural light to kind of just flood the space, and just for to a lot of things to promote community. So in every building that's constructed with Indwell, we it's a very thoughtful process to how can we promote community within our buildings, and even some of the smallest details, like the laundry room is not in the basement, so that you're not in a dark, scary place at night. So just little things like that. But the mission, vision, and values for Indwell is to build hope and homes for all. We are a Christian charity, and we create affordable housing communities that support people seeking health, wellness, and belonging. So, kind of my day-to-day job has some pretty good built-in boundaries for my work with our tenants. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a counselor, but I do offer just kind of practical emotional support for our tenants. So we have office hours where the door to my office is open and available for tenants to drop in, usually 3 times a week. And like I said, that's kind of just a built-in boundary where, if I'm involved in something else, and a tenant comes to me with a need, a lot of times it's easy for me to say, we can talk about that tomorrow during office hours. So we do have a lot of events and activities that we try to get people involved in. I do run a music club once a week. We have a baking group. We have a cooking class. There's tea time once a week. So we do what we can to promote community and belonging. Most of the tenants that live with Indwell, the common denominator is that they're low-income folks. So that's really the only requirement to live in an Indwell building, is just the fact that you need affordability. So that's a real struggle. That's a daily struggle. A lot of our tenants are on disability, Ontario Disability, ODSP, and they're making about $1,200 a month. So most of us, at least most of the people in my circle of friends, and kind of my network of support, that's incredibly low, in comparison to what we're used to, the standard of living. So imagine having $1,200 a month and then trying to find an apartment to rent in this city in 2019. It's almost impossible. It's hard enough for someone like me, a white male that has a good community. It's hard enough for a lot of us to find an affordable place to live. So when you're on a limited income, it's almost impossible. So the fact that we can offer, an apartment for in the neighborhood of $500, that's going to really stretch their income quite a bit. But the months, there always seem to be more days than you have money to cover when you're on a limited income like that. So some of the desperation that comes with that is a very real thing, especially at the end of the month. There's going to be that desperation is going to be a little bit heightened. So that's something that I've become aware of, since working in this field, is to understand that folks on a limited income, they're quite capable and independent, at the beginning of the month when they have enough money, but they get more and more desperate as that month kind of stretches on. So that's just something to be aware of. If you are going to host some potluck dinners or some different meals or events as a church, You might want to think about hosting them near the end of the month. That's a practical thing that you can do to really help folks like that. Um, as I was saying, yeah, some of the boundaries that are kind of easy for me to make with our tenants come with my job. So if a tenant comes up to me and asks me, "Oh, can you give me a bus ticket? Oh, can you loan me some money?" It's easy for me to say no in with my established role to say no, I'm not allowed to do that. Here's some resources. Here's some ideas that you can do. But what I found is that when you step out of that role and you are in, maybe it's the church circles, when those boundaries are a little bit harder to establish, that's when it gets really tricky, and that's when as people of faith, that's when the Christian calling becomes real. That's when the rubber hits the road. So my wife and I, yeah, we host a home church group. We call them missional families in our church, and I found that is when the boundaries became really difficult, and saying no to certain people became really hard. So we had some people coming to our home group that were low income folks, living on the margins, and all the struggles that come along with that. So there were a couple people that were coming to our group that had some pretty serious issues with their hygiene. Um, I think it's easy just to be candid and blunt with you guys and tell you a quick story if you're okay with that. So um, when we first started hosting this missional family, yeah, these people were coming, and we were opening our home, and they smelled terrible. Uh, it was quite pungent, to the effect that we could still smell it in our house when they left, and we ended up just scouring Google and reading, like, how do we make this smell get out of our home, and how do I deal with these feelings of, I don't want you to come back into my house. Um, it was hard. We ended up dousing our couch with baking soda and opening the windows all night, and it worked. After we developed a relationship with these people, because they did keep coming to our house as we were hosting them and feeding them on a weekly basis, um, it became easier to talk about those things. So, without mentioning any names here, I'll just say, um, we'll call this person Joe. Joe, we're really looking forward to having you this week. It's really important that you take a shower before you come. And then I found myself, going with him and walking with him to the laundromat, and walking alongside him and kind of just teaching him how to do this, because um, hygiene is ultimately, it affects your health, right? And it's going to affect a lot of things in your life. So that was a really hard obstacle for me, and especially when I stepped out of my role as staff at Indwell, and it was this boundary was kind of a gray area. This person was in my home. A lot of things changed, and we had to really think. We had to reach out to, yeah, a lot of people in our church and our network, and say, like, what do you think we should do? And it's okay to brainstorm and to talk, and to not know. It's okay to not have the answers. There were some other difficult questions that came as we continued to host that group, like, we've been evicted, we don't have anywhere to live, can we stay with you tonight? And good Christian people want to say yes to questions like that. And we had to learn how to say no. And that doesn't mean that we don't love these people. And that doesn't mean that we're not following our Christian faith. That means that we've established a boundary, and we're going to respect that boundary. And I can't tell you what that's going to be, what that's going to look like for you and for your church and for your group. but I think it's important to honor those boundaries. And if it's something that you've decided on, that you stick with it. So working at Indwell, I've learned about a lot of the resources that are available. So one of the most important ones that I learned about was the Housing Help Center, and that's downtown Hamilton on I think it's on Main Street, just across from the tallest building in Hamilton, Landmark Place. So the Housing Help Center, there's this funding available called the Housing Stability Benefit, and you're eligible for this every 2 years, and it's up to $800. So we had people in our church, where folks were asking them like, I want to move into a new apartment, but I can't pay first and last month's rent. So can you write me a check? Whoa. No, I can't. But you can go to the Housing Help Center and you can apply for the Housing Stability Benefit, and you're eligible for that every 2 years. And if you have, a letter from your landlord that says you have an apartment, you can qualify for $800. So just knowing about some of those resources was really helpful for me and for our church group, and just letting other people know about those too. So it makes it easier to have those boundaries and to say no, and I still love you, and you can still be a part of our community. We deal with a lot of dirty apartments at Indwell. We deal with pests. We're getting really good at eliminating them, and we're getting really good at keeping our numbers really low for those things, and for bed bugs and things like that. But it's because we have clear roles and we have clear routines in place. Every 2 weeks at the Perkins Center, we do apartment checks. So we're going in and we're reminding folks, hey, you need to do your dishes. We're going to check your bed. We're going to make sure there's no bed bugs. And here's what you can do. You can clean this, and give them some direct instructions on what to do. So I guess that in a nutshell is kind of my experience with how my work has intersected with my personal life, and how this Christian calling that we all feel, how you can be Christ and show love to people in ways that affirms who they are as a person, affirms their dignity, and gives them an opportunity to contribute, and gives you a chance to have a boundary and to respect those boundaries. So I think I'll end right there, and we can maybe pass on to another panelist. And I think there will be a chance for questions and answers at the end. Does that sound right? Okay. Kevin?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad Brian went first. He kind of, summarized what I was trying to say. I got to be honest, I had a really hard time trying to figure out, articulate what it is I wanted to say to you folks tonight. As Amy said, I've been a police officer for 13 years here in Hamilton. A lot of different experiences. I'll just break that down a little bit more. 8 years up on the mountain in patrol. And then I spent a year working downtown in the very first year of the action team. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what that is. It's foot and bike patrols, and they pick specific spots of the downtown area and concentrate in one area. So that year I met a lot of folks that I had never met before. Really disadvantaged, homeless, plagued by addiction. Involved in criminal activity, as some would say, the lowest part of society, and it really did open my eyes a little bit. as to what is in this city or what is everywhere, right? So spent a year there. I ended up going back up the mountain for work reasons, and I spent several years in the role of a detective, which was a little bit different in that I spent a lot of time on individual investigations as opposed to kind of bouncing from call to call to call. So you got to build relationships with people, and you built relationships with people that were involved in those similar situations. So I got to realize that, these are real people with real issues, and it's so easy just to drive by them on the street and see them, sitting on the sidewalk and not think twice about it. But when you develop a relationship with them, you realize, yeah, their problems are just as real as your own personal problems. So, again, God was showing me a different part, I guess, of these people that live in these situations. They're that they're real people as well. I spent a short time in the homicide unit. That was eye-opening, like you wouldn't believe. I don't think that's an experience that many people get to be a part of. It's you're dealing with people in the worst possible situation of that they could be in. So a loved one quite often has been killed at the hand of another person, which to deal with those similar people in similar circumstances. A number of the homicides that I worked on were out here in the East End. So it's a different perspective because we had a really specific goal in mind. So you're not spending as much time, as I said, with the prior, building relationships, but you get to find out everything about a family, for instance, and the relationships between them, and who was getting along with who, and what happened before, and why did certain things. So yeah, you're really, getting a good idea of how these people live. And when I say these people, I mean people that quite often most people don't have any interaction with. And I think most of us have similar backgrounds in the sense that we grew up in homes that had running water and beds and food in the fridge, and you went to school, and when you came home, there was a parent, one or two parents, or somebody there to greet you at home. So when I'm referring to families or people that don't have one or any of those things. So just to move on, I've now been since July a patrol officer here in the East End, and again, it's being aware of what's going on, and especially this community here. There's some great people here, fantastic people, personalities that you meet and you talk with them, you just want to sit and talk with them all day long. But you see really the challenges that they face as well. And this community that God's called you to has its share of challenges. I think you're doing a wonderful thing here, but I want, and above all, I want you to be able to do it, as Amy said, to do it safely. Because there is a real possibility of something happening or people coming in that may not have what you want them to have. Their desires may not be the same as yours. They may be looking for things that you may not know that they're looking for. Or you may have somebody coming in, as we would call a person in crisis. How do you deal with a person in crisis? How do you deal with a person that's armed with a knife and wants to end their life? How do you deal with somebody who was just sexually assaulted in the back lot and they've come to you for help? What do you do? So I think the word boundaries that Brian brought up is that's the exact word I was looking for and I couldn't think of. As a church, you need to have boundaries. And what those are, as Brian said, I'm not sure, I can't say what those are for you. But what I can say is that I think as a church, you need to determine when it is that you decide to call the police, when it is that you decide to call EMS. And not because you want to put that person in jail, not because you want to get that person in trouble, but you want to get that person the help that they need. As a police officer, we do investigate the criminal offenses. We do, people do go to jail, but that is not our primary focus in every single situation. We get just today. I work today. I'd say more of the situations I dealt with were people that were in crisis, as opposed to criminal investigations. So you're saying, okay, how can I get them in touch with an organization like Indwell? Or how can I get them in, to a place where they're not going to harm themselves? I could go on for a long time about all this stuff, and I don't want to bore you with it all, but I think as a group, you have a very good mission here, but I don't want anybody to be hurt in the process of executing that mission, I guess is the best way that I can put it. And to do that, be comfortable with calling the police, be comfortable with calling 911, because we are in this community 24/7. We are very familiar with a lot of the people that do need the most help, because we get called to help them a lot, quite often. So the last thing I want to touch on is what happens when you call 911, what happens when you call the police. Now, I can't give a general, this is what happens every single time. I can give you a pretty good idea. So I think maybe, and the reason I bring this one up is because I think it's probably the most likely to happen, if anything, is a person in crisis. And what that looks like could be a million different things. But a person that comes into the church here and who's not in a good place, whether it be they're looking at hurting themselves, they're looking at ending their life, they're looking at hurting somebody else, for instance. A decision needs to be made quickly, relatively, once you understand what's going on, to call 911. Now, every call that goes into 911 is prioritized. So it depends on what you tell them determines how quickly we come. If a person's in a safe environment, they're with somebody else who's able to keep them safe, the priority would be lower. If a person's armed with a knife and is threatening to do something with that, that would be a very high priority. So that gets dispatched exactly that way. So it would be, we need units to come over to wherever for a person with a knife. And we would come knowing with all that information. If it is a high priority call like that, we would stay on the 911 would stay on the phone with you, and the regular updates you're providing to them is getting sent to the officer. So we know what's happening, and we have a decent idea of what we're walking into. Our number one goal in everything we do is the protection of life. That's our focus on everything. So that includes the person that we're being called for, as well as everybody else. So I know, if you go on YouTube and you want to look up police brutality, there's a million different videos you can watch, most of them taken out of context, but our priority is the preservation of everybody's life, everyone. So we would deal specifically with that person, and we would use the de-escalation training that we receive to get that person de-escalated. That's our goal, to do that. And then we determine, what do we do? Like, can this person go home? Does the person need to go to the hospital? Do we need to take them to the hospital? I mean, there's a myriad of different results that can happen. And I think as a church, you could be a great help for us, just providing that information to the officers. Once they've determined what needs to happen, they'll likely ask whoever called, say, okay, tell us what happened, and if anybody, if there's anybody else that has to offer anything, you can offer it to them at that point. Hopefully, resolve it peacefully. That's kind of the goal there. So I'm sure there'll be questions about that. I'll try to do my best to answer, but I think I'll pass it over to John.
Thank you, gentlemen. Sometimes it's dangerous to give me a mic. I like talking, and I like talking a lot about the subject matter that I often do talk about. As I was introduced, my name is John Katecki, and I'm Director of Family Outreach Ontario Christian Addiction Support Services. And some of you may have come across that name in some literature that we put out to different churches. I was so happy. I was coming out to Christian Mercy Church. Was it Mercy Christian Church? It did not have Reformed in the title. So I told my wife, I'm not going to Reformed Church tonight. I'm going to another church. It looks like it's a little independent church, East End of Hamilton. And I find out tonight that you guys are not what you seem to be. There are roots. Family Outreach Ontario has its roots within the Reformed denomination. Started out in 1986 as a CRC initiative, and later spread throughout other Reformed denominations. In 2007, they became independent of any specific church denomination, but it's still largely the Reformed churches that, in various denominations, that support the work we do. We're a small organization, working primarily in the Niagara Peninsula, perhaps out to the Guelph, Kitchener-Waterloo, London areas, and sometimes beyond those. And we do a couple of things. We try to reach out. We believe that the biggest problem that people have in addressing the issue of addiction is lack of understanding or misunderstanding, lack of information or misunderstanding the information that's available regarding addiction. So we try pretty hard, the best we can anyhow, to try to educate those people who are interested in listening to what we might have to say about addiction. And then the other thing we do is, and something I'm particularly involved with, is trying to reach out and help individuals who are at that point in their life where they don't know what to do about a loved one who's struggling with addiction, or perhaps themselves who's struggling with substance abuse. So there's an 800 number that they call, and I receive those calls, and then I sort of deal with them the best I can. To understand what I do, it would be helpful if you understand where I came from. I'm a recovering alcoholic or a recovered alcoholic, depending on who I'm talking to and what their affiliations might be with support groups. I struggled with alcoholism. I was brought up in a Christian home, lived in the church as part of my way of life, albeit not Reformed church. Kauteki, I'm not Reformed. I'm not Dutch. But I was brought up in a very, very clearly Bible-believing environment, and yet I succumbed to alcoholism. And mine was a closet affliction. I hid it really well, and it carried on until I was 46 years old. And then I was confronted at my place of employment. And I'm so grateful I was, because otherwise I would not be here today. I would be very much dead. I was willing in my addiction to give up my marriage, give up the relationship I had with my children, do all sorts of what we call insane and crazy things, just because I was unwilling to admit that I had a problem. And in what you're trying to do over here, I think it's really important that you understand a few things about addiction. And so in a very, very small period of time, I'm going to try to do my best to give you some information on that. My affliction was alcoholism. Ethyl alcohol is simply a drug. It's a drug in liquid format. So it's just alcoholism is just a form of drug addiction. There's a lot of similarities, and yet there's some other differences from what you might understand as street drugs or drug addiction. All under the label of substance abuse or substance use disorder, I think is a more technical, politically correct way of saying it. But we're really talking about addicts. And the very nature of addiction is what is probably the most important thing for you to understand. And for me to try to explain it, in the simplest model in regard to alcoholism, there would be three different types of drinkers. The most common type of people who drink alcohol would be what's referred to as a social drinker. And a social drinker is someone who'll drink anywhere from one or a couple of drinks a day to one or a couple of drinks a year. In this particular model, the amount of alcohol they consume isn't the important thing. What is important is whether they get into trouble or have problems created in their life as a result of their drinking. And in this case, you get to determine what problem or trouble in their life could mean. Problems in their marriage, problems in their families, in their work, with the law, problems with finances, schoolwork. You get to name the list. And a social drinker, if they do get into trouble as a result of their drinking, it's sort of like putting their hand on a hot stove. They learn their lesson, ouch, it hurts, they're just not going to do it again, and they don't for the most part. Second category is what we refer to, and this is a very simple model, but what we refer to as a problem drinker. And a problem drinker is someone who basically binges on occasion and or even frequently, and as a result of their binging is defined here as having more than 5 standard drinks in one event. And as a result of their binging, they do get into trouble, but unlike the social drinker, they don't seem to mind the hot stove, and they repeat that behavior. Perhaps weekend after weekend, every Monday, swearing to never do it again. Okay, so that would be a problem drinker. What they have in common, social drinkers and problem drinkers, is the element of choice. They can choose to either continue drinking or to stop drinking, continue taking their drugs or stop taking their drugs. It's a matter of free will. It's simply for a problem drinker because they've got their, most often their social life sort of revolves around alcohol in my case, and so that might be more difficult for them to stop, but they can still make that choice and stop. The third category is the alcoholic/drug addict, and that individual no longer has that choice. And what that means is that they have lost the ability to stop taking their drug on their own. Okay, and it's really, really important that you understand that, because the alcoholic or the drug addict does not understand that. Even right until I was a chronic alcoholic, so I drank huge amount of alcohol every day in my affliction, and right up till a week before I was confronted, I would have denied I had a problem. Because in my mind, I could still stop drinking if I wanted to, I just didn't want to. And that's the way that the mind manipulation works. And the result is that people that you meet, people within your church, people outside of your church that you meet in the community, if they're struggling with an addiction, a substance abuse, they may swear to you on their mother's grave that they're going to stop drinking this time for sure, or stop taking their drugs this time for sure. I'm serious, I promise. And even though their intentions are 100% pure, their ability to do that doesn't exist. And if you put a gun to their head and say that if you ever use your drug again, I'm going to have to shoot you, then you're going to have to be prepared to pull the trigger, and someone's going to be calling our police friend on the end, and I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. That's the nature of addiction. Okay, that's one of them. Alcoholism was first called a disease back in 1955. I remember that year because that's when I was born, so that makes me an old guy, so respect me. But it was first called a disease by the American Medical Association primarily for 2 reasons. Number one, it's progressive in nature. It very seldom gets better on its own. It always gets worse. So it's progressive. And number 2, without any intervention or help, it will lead to premature death. Okay, so without that very loving individual who intervened in my life, I would be dead for now, and I truly do believe that. I would have been dead a long time ago. That's probably the most important thing. Let me just perhaps explain the role of alcoholism versus other drugs, and particularly opioids, for which we're hearing a lot of stuff on the news anyhow. In the people that I interact with, people who call that 800 number that I talk to, and over the course of the years I've been doing this, I'm talking thousands of people, I keep stats on the cases I get, not on the individuals, but simply the case. What type of case was it, etc. And I'm still getting like probably around 80%, 75 to 80% of all of the cases I'm involved with have to do primarily with alcohol as the drug of choice. And the other 20-25% combination of street and prescription drugs, primarily street drugs right now, with opioids being the biggest problem. Okay, so my world is got the focus still primarily on alcoholism, whereas in the East End of Hamilton, I don't know what your world will look like. But if other drug addiction is similar to alcoholism, here's where it differentiates itself. And that's primarily in order to become, there's two components to an addiction of substance abuse. The first one is a mental component, and then there's a physical component. The mental component is what we loosely refer to as cravings. It's that voice in the back of your head that that compels you to pick up the next drink or to take the next hit or to take the next joint or whatever it is you're dealing with. And it's a very, very powerful phenomenon, this mental component. And all addictions, whether they're substance abuse, it could be gambling, it could be pornography, it could be anything that may not deal with substance, they all have that mental component. And that's the big nasty one. The second component is a physical component. So if someone is alcoholic in the third stage or third phase of the disease, then they no longer will be able to stop taking their drug without a lot of harmful withdrawal effects. And you need to understand that as well, because going cold turkey, if you are alcoholic or a drug addict, can be very dangerous and can lead to death for some people. But whereas alcohol would take 10 to 15 years of sustained drinking before you become physically addicted. It can be shorter depending on the amount of alcohol you drink. Opioids, you can develop that addiction within 4 or 5 days of use. So that gestation period from which you just might be playing around with the drug to the point where you're fully physically dependent on that drug. And if you stop taking the drug, you go into really terrible withdrawal. And the easiest way to calm that withdrawal, the biggest part about the withdrawal is the high levels of anxiety, delirium tremors, sweats, that type of thing. But the easiest way to fix that problem is to take another drink, take another hit. And those two things for the drug addict / alcoholic make it very, very difficult for them to stop being an addict. Okay, the treatment and recovery, and I'll close with this, primarily revolves around admitting that you've got a problem and recognizing that you cannot fix this problem on your own and you need the help of others. And the people who are most equipped to help the alcoholic is the person who struggled with alcoholism. The person who's most equipped to help the person who's hooked on heroin is the person who has been hooked on heroin and has had a measure of victory in their struggle. Okay, so if you haven't had that type of experience, life experience, it would be difficult for you to walk alongside to the point of being accountability partners and or sponsors to individuals that are trying to get better. Okay, that does not discount your requirement as being a follower of Jesus Christ to love people and to try to love them effectively. And that's where you're going to spend some time trying to figure out what that might look like in your case. We've already heard a lot about boundaries, and you got to figure out what those boundaries are. But issues such as judging people, judging me because I'm alcoholic, judging me because I'm a drug addict, is the very easiest way to get someone to never talk to you again or to never come back to your church or to never want to see you and really interact with you in the future. Okay, people who are using drugs seem to have this sixth sense of you're judging me, and that's the one thing that I really, really caution people against. And whatever else you do, if you do it in genuine love, brotherly love, it can go a long ways to cementing some really worthwhile relationships, whether you are helping them with a specific journey of recovery or not. But there will come a time when the person who's getting better will start to become spiritually reawakened. It happened to me even though I went to church all those years, it wasn't until I was in recovery, actually in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, where I saw Jesus Christ in a very, very personal and real way. And it impacted my life, changed my life. And so other people, as they get better, often we talk about that spiritual reawakening that happens in recovery. So if you've maintained a relationship with these people, don't treat them as us versus them or as those people, but are inclusive to including them within your family in the ways that make sense. Then when they're ready to open their hearts to more spiritual inclinations, then you're in a really good spot to minister to them. And I will not talk anymore. Am I doing okay, Amy? She worries about me, I can tell. So, what do you want to do now? Who's got questions? Easy ones come this way, hard ones to that dude over there. I don't know how much you know about fentanyl. There's a little story about how the opioid crisis came into existence, and it all happened by the work of a pharmaceutical company in the U.S. called Purdue Pharma in the mid 1990s, and they were extolling this wonderful drug they had, OxyContin, and it was a type of oxycodone. And they were saying that it's non-addictive, and they marketed the heck out of this thing. And between the mid-1990s and the middle part of, 2004, 2005, a huge number of people became addicted to opioids by virtue of being prescribed drugs. Then through some huge lawsuits, Purdue Pharma had to change the way they made the oxycodone, so you couldn't crush it and inject it or snort it. So the well of opioids dried up for a lot of people. They turned to heroin. And then mid-19 or 2005, 2007, right up till the early part of 2013, 14, the heroin market was starting to, supply was starting to lessen. And that really spurned the use of fentanyl. And fentanyl is a synthetically produced opioid. It's probably I've read articles where it says it's 100 times more potent than morphine. And what that means, it comes in a granular format. So what that means is that if you get even a couple of granules, too many in whatever it is you're using, perhaps as a recreational drug, then you can literally go into overdose. So that's what's causing a lot of these premature deaths as a result of opioid use. And that's where the name fentanyl comes in really hard and heavy. And if anything, that's what you want to watch out for. So any used needles, stay right away from them. Short of that, I don't know if there's any drug paraphernalia, treated as though it's germ-based, because it is germ-based. If you eliminate those type of things, drug paraphernalia in particular, I think that's probably the worst of it that I'm aware of. Do you know of any others?
Yeah, we run into this quite often. We have had incidents where officers have come in contact with, and a bit of a debate whether it's fentanyl or carfentanil. Carfentanil, I guess, is a more potent version of fentanyl. In our training, they show us a little, I'm sure you know what a little dime baggie is, little small Ziploc bags, and they'll have like 3 or 4 granules in it and say, this here is enough to kill you. That scares all of us, and we're like, oh, okay, I'm not doing, anything to do with that. So our standard practice is we double glove when we suspect fentanyl or carfentanil is to be present. When is that? Well, your guess is as good as mine. Any addict could be consuming that. So for us, for our personal protection, we always double glove if we believe it's in an environment. We'll do everything we can to keep people out and make sure it gets cleaned up properly. For you, needles, huge. And this is something for your children as well to know, to stay away from, because you will come across needles in this parking lot and in the grassy area out back or in the sidewalk out front. Especially as the weather grows colder, you're going to have people likely using in the little alcoves and corners of the building, and they'll leave behind the paraphernalia as well. And I'm not trying to scare you, and I'm not trying to say they're horrible people for doing so. I just want you to be aware that this stuff is going to be around, and to know, especially your children, know what they like. Pull it up on Google and say, this is a needle. It's got a little orange cap usually on the end if it's capped. If it's not, it'll just be the syringe. I'm probably not, I don't have the terminology right, but the sharp part. But that could be broken off. You could see blood inside. It could seem clean, but it likely isn't clean. So all of those things, little dime bags, especially if they have a little white residue on the inside, it could be just cocaine. I say just cocaine. Could be, see now my policing side's coming out a little bit. It could be cocaine or crack, or it could be fentanyl or carfentanil. Heroin tends to be, we call it purple heroin. That's usually what we see. It's a real dark, kind of has a purplish tinge to it. But these are all things that your children should be aware of to stay away from as well as yourselves. And if you come across it, I don't know if there is a Sharps container here, if that's something you've thought of. That might be a good idea to have a couple Sharps containers available and have some training on how to deal with that. It's not rocket science. I mean, really pick it up with gloves. Always have, we used to use the blue ones, use the black ones. Now I can't think of the names. It's been a long day. But always pick it up with gloves and dispose of it properly. But know what those things are, because you will come in contact with them. It's very prevalent in this area. So does that help? Does that answer? Yeah. Okay. Anything else to that, Brian? You probably see just as much as we do.
Before I worked with Indwell, I worked at downtown at the Living Rock Youth Center, and we used to take youth to Beasley Park once a week to pick up garbage and whatnot. And we would find needles in that park, at least 2 to 3 every week. And at some, like I remember the record was like 13 that we found in one day, just cleaning up a park. So it's definitely around.
Yeah, so I'm sure I'm part of it's now called again the emergency response team at Blessings. That was something we started, I'm sure all of you remember, a year and a half ago or so. We had that gentleman who lost consciousness in the church, and we realized really quickly we got to kind of come up with some policies and how to deal with this as a congregation. So that's kind of been a work in progress. I can work with Amy and share with what we have, because we've recently, it still has to be approved. We've revamped it to make it a little more simpler, because we found it was a little too much. What we kind of bit off more than we could chew initially. But yeah, I think you should have some policies in place. We also have one for Blessings that surround the idea of lockdown and hold and secure, kind of modeled after what the schools do, and shelter in place and things like this. And those are procedures that you guys can undertake very easily as a congregation to deal with situations that you may come across. There's actually a security conference coming up at Hope Christian Church at the end of November. I was hoping to go. It doesn't look like I'll be able to go, but as a church, if you could have somebody go to that conference, I think it's November 25th. These are things that they're going to be talking about there as well, how to deal with situations. So yes, I think you should have some sort of policy that everybody's familiar with. It can't be like inclination sometimes is to become very specific. Okay, if this happens, this is what we do. If this, and invariably what's going to happen is you're going to be presented with a situation that's not covered in your policy, and then everyone's going to say, okay, what do we do now? So the idea is just to have a general understanding of what is expected. So I would say if you're presented with a situation where quite obviously criminal behavior is going on, and by that I mean somebody has been assaulted, somebody's breaking into cars, there's drug use going on, like blatantly drug, like drug activity, whether it be drug dealing or you know, there's people in your lot, you're not sure what they're up to. The expectation I would think would be to call the police, because that's not something as a church you can effectively deal with and safely deal with. If you have somebody coming in that needs help and wants food and is looking for fellowship, absolutely 100%. That's more, I would say, what, you know, your role or the church's role. But dealing with potentially violent or dangerous situations, I wouldn't say as a church that should be something that you would undertake, if that's fair.
There might be a little bit more that you could do proactively. If you can appreciate that the best people to help the alcoholic is the recovered alcoholic, and the best people to help the drug addict is the person who struggled with drug addiction, as an example, then one of the things I always hope to accomplish is to make it okay to have these discussions and to remove the need for anonymity in issues pertaining to substance abuse, for example. If there are people within your fellowship who have experienced recovery in a way that you can let one or some of the leaders know who you are, then you can be perhaps used in a different way than other people when it comes to those situations where you're trying to help someone with an addiction. That would be one example. And other addictions are the same thing, whether it's gambling addictions, pornography, there's a whole list of them. And so it's difficult because, I mean, Alcoholics Anonymous has that word anonymous there, and it's for a really, really good reason, because people stereotype those people. And I know what that's like. I personally know what it's like. And if you can open that discussion within your church fellowship where it's okay to talk about these openly and lovingly, then you're way ahead of most churches, because most churches don't promote that type of discussion. And so when you do, then the people who God has graced with recovery, because that's what it is, they will step forward and they can really be instrumental in helping you as a group move forward.
I just wanted to echo what Kevin was saying about, don't be afraid to call the police. The worst case scenario, you know, you talk to somebody who's supportive for a while and they talk you through something. It doesn't mean that you're weak or you don't know, or you're less of a person. Like if you call the police, like there are weeks at work where I call the police a lot, and it's okay to call the police.
Unless you get me, of course.
I noticed a lot of people banging on the street corners and sleeping on the grass in the fields in this area. I was wondering if I wanted to reach out to people who are living in those situations, what's a good way to go about that, and if there's any other advice you could give in those. if you're worried about somebody who's homeless and sleeping in the cold, um, you can make a phone call with them to a shelter. I have actually printed off some resources here if you guys want to take some of this when you leave. Just kind of my top. What do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My top phone numbers of resources in the city to call, and then there's a list of organizations that have shelters and like adult drop-in centers. So these are available here. You can also order these awesome little business cards from the mental health and street outreach service from the city of Hamilton. As a church, it would be an awesome resource to just order, like 50 of each of these, and you can just keep this in your wallet. There's just like all these different resources. Coast is a really good resource, which is a crisis service and phone number. They'll give you just like a bright yellow card. It has their number on it. It's 24/7. So it's just great to have some of those resources, on your person. But I think, the first step is just having a conversation with someone. I think there's a lot of different advice out there on, whether to give money to someone begging or not. But if you're making eye contact with them and you're having a conversation with them, that's more than most people would probably do. And to just ask, is there something I can help you with? What do you need? I can't tell you exactly what the right thing to do in that situation is going to be, but if you at least have some resources on hand that you know of, that you can say, have you called this number? Have you gone here? Have you tried this? Sometimes that's a really helpful thing.
Just regarding resources and you talking about individuals on ODSP and running out near the end of the month, which we definitely experienced here too. Do you find that the food banks are able to meet their needs? Like, is that a good place for us to direct people to?
Food banks can be really good. The one critique I would have of food banks is that a lot of times they're giving away sweet pastries. We recently, I'll see this a lot in our tenants' apartments during our biweekly apartment checks. Is the cupboards are just full of sweet pastries, and so I think we forget about that as from where we're coming from. Middle class people. When we get together as a church, that's a really common thing to just kind of have coffee and treats. We try really hard to offer fruit and healthy things, but it's definitely not our default, right? We have to I guess, if they have access to sweet pastries all the time, and then they come to church and it's like, hey, do you want some sweet pastries? Sure. But I think it also has to do with just educating people on, well, if you go to the food bank, what are some things that you can get that are one, gonna last in your cupboard, and number two, there's some nutritional value to it. There's some healthy things to get there. So education around that, and just realizing that a lot of times food banks just have junk.
I call them cases, and probably about 3/4 of all of them are dispensed with on the phone. Often in one phone discussion, sometimes within a couple, but most often in those cases, people are just looking for some kind of information on treatment centers, information on support groups. what can I do, information on tough love and enablement, codependency, myriad of issues. And then otherwise, we do individual. I meet with individuals usually in coffee shops, and sometimes with families, family meetings. And some of them go really well. Some of them are really tough. So, and then. Yeah, and we're really reluctant to give advice. We'll give information, but we have to remember that we're not professionals, and we're not trained to give advice, and we certainly don't want somebody to do what we say and then get in a lot of trouble as a result of it. So what I like to do is I like to, when possible, lay out a few different options and help them through the thought process for different ones.
This is a question for Kevin. I'm just kind of thinking, if you have somebody that's coming into this building, a person in crisis, is there anything in particular that we can sort of do as our regular Sunday organization to kind of intercept that before it becomes a bigger crisis? I know we have people on the welcome team standing above the stairs, but is there anything else in particular that we could do just as a normal organizational thing?
This is where a policy would come into play. What is this on? Oh, okay. What is the best practice? I don't know the layout and I don't know the makeup of the congregation very well, but I mean generally, the goal is to keep whoever is present safe. That's the goal. Now, and I'm being purposefully vague in general because it's very difficult to say specifically what to do, as in, okay, we have this room over here, so we'll put them in that room, room over here. Well, they may not want to go into that room over there. They may want to come down here. Okay, well, if they come down here, then we'll bring everybody over there. But the person may go over there with that. So the idea is to keep everyone safe. And that's why I say be comfortable to call 911 if that's what you recognize immediately, because they will also provide you a suggestion saying who's there, who's present. Is there a large group of people there? Yes, there are. Where are they? Oh, well, they're downstairs. Are there doors? Yes, there's doors. Okay, close those doors. Things like that. But every situation is going to be so, they are usually so fluid and things happen very quickly. I'm not trying to scare you at all, but I'm just saying things happen very quickly. And they may come in and realize, you know what, I don't want to be here, and walk out 4 seconds later and you're on the phone to 911 saying, did I need to call them in the first place? Well, probably, because they're going to continue on in that crisis outside of the building. So, welcome team. If they're familiar, with what to look for, and it's not just one thing, right? I mean, a person in crisis could be a person having a difficulty with their mental illness at that point. That could be peaking, or they may be off their medications, or they may be taking new medications that are not agreeing with them, or they may be in the middle of a high because they've just used too much crystal meth, or it could be a myriad or a combination of all of those things, or they may have just been involved in a violent encounter across the street and now they're running across the road and they've been drinking and they're not really sure what to do. So is that a person in crisis? Maybe, but at the end, I think to be able to recognize that this person is not well and they need some help, being familiar with and comfortable with making that quick decision to call 911, I think is probably the best thing to do.
Like, one of the reasons that I kind of think about that is it's not just adults that are coming here. We have a building full of kids, and they're everywhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Kind of think, if there's something as well, because I think you kind of answered my question.
Yeah, it really is. I think the most important thing is to be aware. Just be aware of what the possibility that this isn't. You're not in the country where people have to drive to church. You're right in the middle of a very active community, and the potential is there for many different things to happen. Oh, yeah. The police are kind of like that too. Yeah. So, yeah.
You had the Michelle Family Church. I can't remember exactly where that model began, but it's definitely something that I think is there's a trend there. The gentleman you're speaking of, where's his church based out of? Portland? Yeah. That sounds right to me. Yeah. Definitely. So without going into too much detail, the church that I grew up in, when I look back on it now as an adult, it was really more of um, a social thing. Everybody that went to my church, for the most part, looked like me. Um, we were all kind of in the same socioeconomic status. Um, so I'm really excited to see, there's a lot of new churches, church plants um, in Hamilton, just across North America that are saying like this this idea of church that we grew up with, it's not actually um, we're not actually we're not actually doing it the way that maybe it should be done, and let's do it different. So the fact that you're starting this church, you're coming to this side of town, um, you're part of that movement, um, so yeah, I think real church happens outside of church, and usually around food. And so those are kind of the core values of this movement. Missional family, home church, whatever you want to call it. It's this new movement, right? Of saying, um, let's meet people's needs, let's give them a meal, let's make them feel like they're a part of something, let's be hospitable. It's less focused on let's have a cool band, or let's have these awesome lights, or this really trendy pastor that has tattoos. Like, it's no tattoos, Ian. It's a reset almost back to what do people need, and the core needs, the basic needs that we need are food and shelter and clothing. So let's start with that, and let's affirm people's dignity, and then we can talk about this God that we believe in.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's talking about Samson was saying about eliminating fear. It's just kind of building relationships with people and knowing the people. I think that's
Mhm.
eliminating a lot of fear from this community.
Yeah. I'll give you just a quick example of when I first started working at the Perkins Center. There was one tenant that, like, before I met him, this dude looked rough, like scary. Just, I'm not going to go into the details of describing him, but like, I wouldn't mess with this dude if I saw him on the street. Like, I would stay away. Now that I know him, now that I see him every day, he's like the sweetest, most gentle person you would ever meet. Um, so yeah, I mean, the Bible tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, um, and that if we're living in that, then we're going to be guarded, and you can't hug somebody with you know closed arms. Um, that's a really good point. There's scary stuff out there, but when you give it a name and you give it a face, it's not so scary anymore. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hesitate to say like never give somebody money because only you can know if that's going to be the right thing to do. But one of the things that our church started doing was taking some of the money that that came in from the offerings and buying some grocery cards. And so there would be certain people on our leadership team, and our pastor even would have grocery cards kind of just on hand. So that's an option. Um, yeah, there's always going to be something else. Like there's a lot of thinking creatively that happens. Um, but if somebody's really adamant about like, well, I need money, it has to be money, it has to be money, I would probably avoid that. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a hard question. Um, Jesus doesn't say give money to everyone who asks, right? So, and this, sorry, I forget your name. We met once before, just behind you. Yeah, yeah. We, Sanson, that's right. Sorry. You asked a question earlier, and the way I took it was a little bit different perhaps than everyone else when you asked about fear, right? I mean, you have this fear, and I'm not trying to instill this idea of fear, that you have to be afraid of everybody that comes in here. That's not what I'm advocating for. But on the other hand, you may have people come in that may ask for certain things that kind of makes you think for a second, like why, for what reason could you possibly want that? And you're right, there's a lot of creative thinking that goes on, and you may not understand where they're coming from, which is why boundaries are important, which is why knowing what you can provide to them is really important. You can't fill in for the police. You can't fill in for fire. Like if the building was on fire, you would call the fire department, right? If you have an alcoholic, the person that can help that person more the most is a recovering alcoholic. So yes, give them to the best of your ability, and that may not be what they're asking for. Is probably the best way I could put it. I don't know if that's okay.
Yeah, you can give of your time. You can give of your community by opening up a space for them to be a part of that. There's a lot of things that you can give besides money.
So people with addictions, particularly maybe alcohol, but also drug, of course. Do you recommend a certain association with AA or Celebrating Recovery, or you say whatever's the closest, whatever's in your neighborhood, and do you have kind of reference points to say, there is a Celebrating Recovery happening at X, building X, or at this church, or how do you help people who,
There aren't very many faith-based options to send people to. That's probably just the reality of the world we live in. There's something like 42 different Celebrate Recoveries across Ontario, so it doesn't take too long to sort of know where they are. I always ask people where they're calling from and where their loved one is from if it's not themselves. And I also I do ask them about their what do they have much of a faith? I just come out and ask them, are they believers, and what's their church life look like, and to get a sense of whether spiritual issues are really important to them or not, because our name is Family Outreach Ontario Christian Addiction Support Services. So we get a lot of people that contact us from within the greater Christian community. But I'm really a strong proponent of 12-step programs, And I love the 12-step program as it was originated way back in 1935, which it was derived from Scripture, and it's gotten watered down severely in the secular programs as they were trying to reach out to other religious groups or faith groups. But even in its secular intent, it's still a faith-based you still believe in a higher power. There are organizations programs such as Celebrate Recovery, Life with Renewal, right within the Canadian Reformed, United Reformed churches. Life Renewal is a neat little program that is basic. It's essentially taken from a 12-step a step study within Celebrate Recovery, and they've formulated this program. But to get to know what they might be in this area, you don't have a lot of choices. Hamilton does not have a Celebrate Recovery. The closest Celebrate Recovery is in Compass Point Church in Burlington, or there's a church in Grimsby that has one, and those are the choices, or St. Catherine's. So people are calling from downtown Hamilton, and they don't have a way of getting around Burlington or AA. So I'm always, you will have people, as you get bigger, you will have people that are very solid AA members right within your own fellowship. But they've been trained to not talk about it because of the stereotyping of the world. So AA is readily available to almost anyone right across Ontario. So I never lose sight of that. And in different pockets of the area, I don't know what's available in this area. There's little independent groups that are really neat. I know of a couple throughout the peninsula, and they meet on different nights, and I send people to those. But AA, I know that there's some, if you're affiliated with Canadian Reformed Church, I know there's some really strong AA members in the Hamilton area and within the Canadian Reformed Church. And these would be sort of neat to know who they are. And one thing you have to understand, people who go through 12-step programs, the 12th step is having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, we carried these principles out in all of our affairs. So what that means to the person who's recovering is that part of your recovery requires you to go out and help others who are struggling as you once were. And that's so biblical when you take a look at Paul and what he wrote in 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4. Where it says that God gives us a comfort, and it's his comfort that we give to others who are hurting when they need comforting. It's just so absolute scriptural. But these people who are in 12-step programs, who genuinely get into the depth of the step studies, they will be only too happy to reach out. That's why I'm here tonight. That's a good point, and I should have mentioned that. AA is called Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's two different types of meetings that are common. One is what's called a speakers meeting or an open group meeting, and the other is called a closed group meeting. Any one of you people could take someone to an AA open meeting. Everyone, the whole world is welcomed. Only those who believe they have issues with alcoholism are invited to closed meetings. Okay, so you can go to AA meetings yourselves. Al-Anon is a group for codependents of the alcoholics, whether they're spouses or whether they're siblings, parents, children, whoever. You will go there and you will meet up with other individuals who are struggling just as you were. Just before I came here tonight, I was on the phone for half an hour with this young lady from London, Dorchester, and Christina is her name, and she has been, she's called me probably about 4 times over the last 5 years, and she has been taking this journey. Her husband is not getting better with his alcoholism, but she is. She's getting remarkably better. She's a strong woman, and God has done an amazing work in her life. And it was through these support groups, because it was in these support groups that she met these other people who were helping. I often give a little a little picture analogy regarding how it works. But if Brian and I were to go up in an airplane over the jungles of Brazil, and I put a parachute on him, and I open the door, kick him out, pull his ripcord, and say, "Have a wonderful life." He's never been in those jungles before. The chances of him coming out alive and well are almost zilch. But if I strap a parachute on as well, and I go out with him, and I've been in those jungles, and I know how to get out well, I know how to live, then Brian's chances of surviving go way up, especially if he does what I say. That's how recovery works. That's exactly how it works. So whether you're the person who's struggling with the affliction, or whether you're otherwise affected because you're in relationship with that person, it works the same way. It's the same 12-step program. My time is up.
No, I promised them that they would be, we'll take one more question. I promised them that we would be done by 9:30 because they do start work early, so we start.
Okay, so if there's somebody in crisis where you're staying that you call 911 and those people will be provided with the services they need. But if there are people who are witness to this and need support after that, is the police that can provide that support, or should we have, like numbers available or counseling available for those people?
Yeah, the short answer from the police would be no. It's not because that's not something we don't want to do. We don't have the capability or the resources. There's, and I've seen some of the numbers on this piece of paper. There are a myriad. We live in we're really fortunate to live in the city of Hamilton, because there's a ton of resources in the city of Hamilton that deal with this. I know through the COAST program, which has a number of different facets to it. There's a 24-hour emergency line that people that are in crisis can call, and they can speak to a worker. There's also teams of nurses and police officers that go out together as part of the COAST program to go assess, see if how the people are doing, and that's more of a follow-up thing. There's a couple other parts to COAST as well. There are different agencies out there that can help with that. I don't know if Brian do you have any suggestions as far as that goes, or?
So in regards to like people here in the church that might need like support after a crisis, yeah, there's some options out there. There's an organization called Shalem, which offers counseling at reduced rates for churches, which is something that St. Clair's involved in. I don't know if there's probably like a congregational rate that you could get through them. Catholic Family Services also has like income-based counseling services available. So those are just two that kind of great. Yeah, Christian Counseling Center. Where's that? In Burlington. So yeah, that would be awesome if you as a church could decide on like something that you would maybe offer to your congregation. But that's a great question. We have something like that at Indwell for employees, and when we have witnessed traumatic things, it's really important to talk that through and to process that in healthy ways. Yeah.
I'm going to take my answer back. It's funny how you compartmentalize some things and then you say, oh, that doesn't apply to this. But actually, for the police, if there is a really traumatic event that happens here, we do have victim services available. And that's 24/7 as well, consisting completely of volunteers that will come out to a scene and help people through what they have seen. If it's something that's and the reason I said no initially, because typically, in my experience, that's for families that have lost a loved one or along those lines. But it absolutely would apply in a situation like this, is if you've been involved in a situation and you're having a real difficult time with it, we can offer victim services and they'll come right out. And the police officers will stay till they get here. And then once they're here and everything's calm, then typically the uniform officers will leave and they'll stay as long as you need. And then they can also liaise and link you with other agencies for further follow-up after that. Quickly, Bridget, before Amy notices.
So, as Annette mentioned earlier, we have lots of little people who are running around here, little kids, and probably little kids that have grown up in neighborhoods that are different than this neighborhood. So, I know I'm always kind of like harping on my kids too. What are some, what's some advice, some quick advice that you could give that we could talk to our kids about? So we already talked about the needles. If you see a needle, come report it, don't touch it. But are there anything else, any other pieces of advice that you would give?
I think it might be a good idea to have some boundaries about where kids can be. For example, I wouldn't have, and it's simple safety things, having them running down the sidewalk, out on the street, that sort of thing. But I think even maybe a conversation with them about just the simple, but very bluntly, stranger danger. I know quite often we chuckle about that, but if an unusual person they don't know comes up to them and starts saying or doing strange things, that's time to come inside or time to go see or go find an adult. Again, this community it's not a war zone, right? It's not, there's, like I said, there's some really incredible people here. But there's some significant challenges as well. So all I would suggest is don't come here with your head in the sand thinking everything's going to be just fine, and everybody that comes through the door, you're going to be able to, give them everything they possibly need. That's the reality is that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, just have some simple safety measures in place, and just be aware that things can happen quicker than you might imagine they would. So just be prepared. Don't live out of fear. Don't fear everybody that comes around. This community, as is every community, and it's actually incredible. When I go home from work and I've dealt with death or whatever, I'm like, all they need is Christ. That's all they need. That's all this community needs is Christ. And that's what you're doing, which is phenomenal. That's exactly what is needed here. But you still put your seatbelt on when you get in your car. So it's kind of the same idea, right? So.
Thank you very much. I think that to touch on the whole fear thing just quickly from a member's standpoint here, this wasn't set up for the purpose that we're afraid, but it's to set up for the reality that we were privileged in a different way than a lot of these people, and we don't understand their life. And I've learned this greatly by walking alongside somebody